Hello and welcome to another episode of Aussie Wisdom. Today I'm with Mark Wist from Property Resolutions. My name's Chris Anderson. As I said, this is Aussie Wisdom. Let's see how this goes. So Mark, what can you tell us about yourself?
Okay, well look, 30 years in real estate. I would have got less for murder. So started out with a degree in valuation and went into valuation on a scholarship. And then moved into research, all of that in Auckland, I think you just lost a whole bunch of viewers.
That's all right. Yeah. All the Kiwis are over here anyway, aren't they?
Well, yeah, about half. Then from there, started a research and consultancy function in a large agency. Country's largest agency, and spent a few years there, then went to Europe and did the whole backpacker thing for a year. That was the best. And in fact, I'd quite like to spend time talking about that, but
okay,
probably.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Then moved to London and did some more research consultancy, and then led a team there, and then came to Australia, was a director of a group called PIR, Property Investment Research, and so that organisation ran evaluations, so analysis and advice to subscribers on listed and unlisted property trusts. Did that for a whole bunch of years. Then moved back to London and started Property Resolutions up there in advisory, and that was sort of around the time of just after the GFC. So there was a lot of fallout from that, particularly in London. It was really ugly. And then came back again and moved into a more advisory role in Melbourne. And was in that for a few years, then moved to Brisbane and commuted to Sydney in a funds management role down there, property funds management. And then a couple of years ago started my own advisory business here, Property Resolutions, in Australia.
Cool. So what is it you're most focused on now?
So now look, I do a bit of independent responsible manager stuff for AFSLs and due diligence management, feasibilities, a bit about off-market asset sourcing. Through those years in Australia, I've developed a bit of a network of asset owners and agents and vendors and all that sort of thing. I also am involved in the education space. And so I do a bit of lecturing and a bit of mentoring and editing of PhDs, pre-submission, and general consulting work, the other sort of research reporting, advisory, M&A, that sort of stuff as well.
Cool. And so obviously we don't have that much time. What do you think would be the best topic for us to focus on, given that we've got, let's say, another half an hour or so?
Okay, well, perhaps some of the things that your viewers or listeners might be interested in are say, the markets and the cycles, yes. Some of the drivers,
yes.
And perhaps some of the history about what happened when and particularly why. And perhaps how Australia is driven compared to, say, the UK, Europe, the US, and the might of New Zealand.
Right. Might is right.
Yeah. Yeah, the East Island.
Cool. Well, look, I'll let you pick any of those. Well, how about we start with, obviously there's a lot of talk in the market at the moment that we could be near, well, obviously we've come down from a peak, but there could be a little bit more in that. What are your thoughts on that? And based on the drivers that you see in Australia, what's your expectation? Okay,
well, to start with, Australia has more markets, more property markets than I can count. So if we're talking about the residential property market, there will always be some number, whether it's plus 5.2%, plus 1.7%, minus 1.2%, doesn't matter. But that isn't actually that relevant beyond a general broad sentiment style direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might find that a few streets in Mosman and Sydney, Peppermint Grove in Perth, and that sort of thing. A few streets in Toorak in Melbourne, and maybe something, a few streets in Ascot here in Brisbane have done or are doing exceptionally well. And then we might find a few suburbs in southwestern Brisbane towards Logan and Ipswich where they've seen zero capital growth for the last decade.
Yes.
And so, or worse. And so, we have this range of 0 or minus through to plus 10, plus 15% in any given year. That distills down to a number across all markets that gets reported and discussed in the media, which can be misinformation. It can be misleading because if somebody in Ascot or somebody in Logan reads that and thinks, wow, that's what's happened to my property, probably not. So that's an important starting point. The residential suburbs have localised drivers and also the macro drivers, and so of course the typical things like interest rates have the bigger impact in the mortgage belt, and also sometimes in the real high value stuff, where there is a lot of debt that might be siphoned off into a business or into other investments because the owners think that property will only ever go up, and that the servicer of that mortgage might be bulletproof. Neither thing might be true, and so sometimes we see some sad cases, and so those localised drivers can be things like infrastructure. A train station, a new train station is a classic. Typically, we will see a big price rise in a location associated with new infrastructure like that, and sometimes also associated with improved retail infrastructure or roads or schools and that sort of stuff. And of course, that can be undone by an oversupply, which has been the major problem in some of the southwest of Brisbane,
yes.
And out of Melbourne and out of Sydney, no different, where there just simply isn't any growth because new product replaces old product in sentiment terms, and old product just gets left on the shelf because why would you pay as much or more for an old house when you can have a brand new one a few streets away? And so that's a classic. So and some of the macro drivers as well, aside from interest rates, wages growth, sentiment, the old wealth effect, and also the gig economy, and how people are reacting to and coping with changes in work habits and work lifestyles, and whether they keep jobs. In the old manufacturing belts in Melbourne, for example, where a lot of people lost a lot of jobs out of the car industry and having to repurpose themselves, and so there's a bit of pain in those areas, and that all affects if they're concentrated in an area and people are listing their homes in order to get out to meet financial obligations, then that of course impacts. Look, in terms of going back to the overall scheme of things, residential property probably has a little bit of pain left in it. I think most of the media is talking about some more negative impact in Sydney and Melbourne simply because they grew too fast anyway. And not so much in Brisbane simply because it didn't grow so fast. That just sort of equalises out, and you've got cross-border migration and those sorts of impacts as well that Queensland has seen so many times over the years, where the northbound migrants from Sydney and Melbourne who are seeking the better lifestyle and the cheaper homes in the hope that they can secure work of some kind up here. So it's difficult to go beyond that, and the overriding issue that from a macro perspective is just simply the debt load in the economic system, in the financial system, Australia doesn't have a mortgage on that, pardon the pun. It is a global issue in the Western world, and the United States is a classic example. And if we see some sort of extraordinary trigger event like we've seen before only 10 years ago, then we could see some additional pain fall out of that. I think eyes wide open this time, unlike last time a little bit when everything was great and everything was bulletproof in 2006, 2007, and then the debt was the new normal. This time I think there is an acceptance that a more conservative attitude to debt is appropriate, and paying down debt is a good strategy, rather than taking on more and leveraging up returns. But the overriding problem is that as I sort of like to say, value is written in sand, but debt is written in stone. So there isn't much you can do about the level of debt, but values can go all over the place, and so you can breach all sorts of covenants, and that can be particularly problematic depending on how the lenders treat that, and whether they throw their mortgagors to the wolves or not. I suspect not this time, because by doing that they're only polluting their own values in their own asset pool. So I suspect they won't do that. But it is the overarching issue that we're facing at the moment. And so that's residential. But in terms of commercial, probably slightly less speculation in the media about commercial real estate. And by commercial I mean office, retail, industrial, and alternatives, healthcare, childcare, logistics, all that sort of stuff. And each of those has its own driver, and each of them is a relatively unique, really only connected by the fact that they are premises enabling business. And so on that, there is significant change happening in the retail sector, for example, if we start there. Retail property has had a history of adapting to change over the years, from the high street to the mall. For example, was a massive one in the 50s, started in sort of the late 50s through 60s through 70s, and all of the wonderment of a central location where you could do everything under one roof and air-conditioned space and all that sort of stuff that we're all accustomed to. And now, of course, with online retailing going from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8% of all traffic, the question is, can retail stores and chains compete, and can they survive? And as we've seen, sadly with so many, the answer is no. And particularly in that sort of log-jammed mid-range fashion type space and shoes, which are favourites of the online stores. But is it the death of retail? No, I don't think so. There will just be a further adaptation. And we saw, for example, a few years ago, when some of the Myer stores and some of the David Jones stores started moving out of the Westfield centres, Westfield simply cut them up and turned them into smaller, more specialised retail stores. So instead of having 2,000 metres to Myers, they might have, say, 15 100-metre stores to Smiggle and to that sort of retailer, and they ended up making more money out of it. because the per square metre rent that they were getting out of Smiggle was a lot higher than they were getting out of Maya, notwithstanding the repurposing of those physical spaces. And then the next evolution of some of the poorly performing neighbourhood and sub-regional centres, the ones that have one supermarket, maybe a supermarket, a discount department store, and a bunch of specialties. And they're the ones that have really suffered in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of cap rate decompression, and also in terms of the capacity of the occupiers to pay rent, because they're the ones that typically are struggling. In mum and dad, newsagent classic. Newsagents are unfortunately going out of business left, right, and centre. I know in my portfolio I had a number of news agencies that to whom I had to extend all sorts of incentives during the term of the lease, not just at the beginning, in order to keep them operating. So the next evolution, one of the next pieces of evolution of those spaces will be perhaps the exit of some of those larger occupiers, and inserting a gym or a medical centre, and that's been done now almost to death. But now taking some of that space and turning it into a last mile distribution hub for some of the online delivery. We might see some of the larger fashion labels and some of the other popular online shopping destinations using this shopping centre space as kind of cohabited warehouse. They might pay and occupy a rack for that suburb out of that space, and it's a delivery point for the purchases in that postcode. That's something that is likely, I think, to happen over the next little while as retail centres start to morph and adapt to what's happening now. Retail has been particularly problematic at that sort of lower convenience end, and people who are perhaps more focused now on non-discretionary spending and just going straight into the supermarket and straight out again, and not going into the specialties to browse and buy. Those little centres have really struggled, so I think we'll also see some remixing and remodelling, and the reintroduction and recreation of food courts, and also importantly more social space, because as we create a more dense set of cities, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, not probably so much here in Brisbane yet, but in those two cities, they're becoming more densely populated as we see the multi-storey apartment blocks spreading from the city into the suburbs, which would have been unheard of beyond the 3-storey walk-up in a Sydney or Melbourne suburb 15 years ago. Now we're seeing 15-storey apartments, 20-storey apartments regularly going up to accommodate the rising population in those metropolitan centres, and so that creates, by its nature, a need for social space, and what better place to do that than in a shopping centre? So repurposing some of that space, and that's fine, but the problem for the owners of that space is that you either get no rent or low rent for that repurposed space. So I'd considered, I had a big space that I just couldn't let in one of my centres, and it was a horrible space in a dark corner. And I thought, like an ice rink or a cinema or something like that, to at least generate some foot traffic and some revenue. But of course, if you're going to put an ice rink I think it was in Queensland, so I didn't have that idea very long. But some sort of or maybe like a miniature theme park for kids or something. But the per metre rate for something like that might be 5% of a typical retail space. But at least it creates a destination, brings people, and that's the primary consideration. So at least the other space that you do have is occupied and generating as much rent as you can. And so that's another solution for some of these smaller neighbourhood and sub-regional centres that might start to struggle under the weight of the shift of retailing from in-store to online. Bearing in mind as well that increase up to towards 8% of the total isn't all coming off. It's not a net zero-sum game because retail sales are growing as well. So it's not all sort of 892 because in-store is growing also. But we've seen in the most recent reporting season, for example, that the leasing spreads, the price per metre of new leases versus renewing existing leases has come down a bit. So that's a sign that retail leasing has been challenging in the last little while. And in the office space, of course, co-working and collaborative working is the big thing now. And I remember I've been writing about hot desking as it was originally since the early 1990s. It's not a new thing. But it's just co-working and flexible hubs and that sort of stuff is the latest evolution of that concept. And we're seeing in all of our main cities now an increasing occupation from these service providers. Many of them international and some of them local. And they're catering to a certain office demographic. People like me that run. I don't run IBM. I run property resolutions, and it's I don't have a lot of people. So it suits me. But mentioning IBM, I think it was about 2017, also adopted that and have taken space internationally, I think London and a few places, to appeal to millennial workers. And also to give themselves a bit of flexibility, so that they too are occupiers of that flexible co-working type space, and ultimately it's quite efficient space, but you need to be able to focus because you have a lot of people and a lot of different things going on around you, so it's that's a skill that needs to be learned and applied, kind of like school, I suppose. A lot of things going on around you if you need to be studying. But ironically enough, just after the GFC, 2000, not much, can't remember exactly when it was, but it was. Can't remember, but anyway, Regis, the British serviced office provider, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and they were a big provider of serviced office space in the United States and in the UK. And so, that is just a bit of a warning that if serviced office and co-working type space starts to take over, it becomes a significant occupier of broader office space. At the end of the day, those service providers are themselves occupiers and lessees. And so if they start to fall over because people stop occupying that type of space and go into satellites and that sort of thing, then the investors are again left exposed to probably overexposed to a category of occupant that is probably yet to be proven over the long term, notwithstanding serviced offices that have been around for a long time, but this co-working type space, which is pretty cool and funky and interesting and vibrant space to be in, and certainly enables networking like nothing else.
Yeah.
Can lead to business being done that may not otherwise have been done. So in terms of markets, each of the cities has its own submarket, and the drivers of Brisbane are quite different to the drivers of Sydney, are quite different to the drivers of Melbourne, and each of the DNA of those three cities is different. Melbourne is huge, spread out, and goes in all directions. St Kilda and Docklands, and the Paris end of Collins Street, and the core and the legal precinct, and it's massive. It'll take you half a day to walk around the whole thing, or more. Whereas it wouldn't take you half a day to walk around the Brisbane CBD.
So not.
And
you run around in half an hour.
Yeah. And so the supply risk is significant in Melbourne, but Melbourne has survived well, notwithstanding sort of in the mid-late 2000s when incentives were really high, if I recall, but because of the highly skilled talent pool that lives around Melbourne. And also the cheaper rental structure that exists there compared to Sydney. So a lot of businesses, international businesses, and that sort of thing, preferred Melbourne to Sydney. And two of the big four banks are down there. So that was a unique selling point for Melbourne compared to Sydney. And Sydney is the finance capital. That's obvious, but has a different DNA as well. And both of those cities benefited from the withdrawal of stock for apartments. And more recently, Sydney has really benefited from the withdrawal of stock for the Sydney transport infrastructure done by the council down there. And they just bought buildings wholesale and knocked them over. I don't know when it's due to be complete, but it's going to be a significant improvement to their underground rail infrastructure down there. And those pads will be available again to be built, and then when those buildings are built, the buildings that were knocked over will sort of typically B grade, C grade, and of course they won't be replaced by B grade, C grade buildings. They'll be replaced by prime A grade, premium type stuff, and that will impact on the supply metrics of that premium office space in Sydney. Suddenly, there will be a bunch of floors available again, because now you're paying through the nose. And if you can get premium style space, office space in Sydney, you're lucky if you can, but give it 5 to 10 years, all of these new buildings coming online progressively, and that'll change the dynamics again. And incentives will start to increase as they've fallen, and rental growth will slow and stop. And whereas rental growth has exploded down there. Brisbane has had a different journey again, with the mining resources boom and 111 Eagle Street and all that sort of stuff. So the DNA and the supply demand metrics and the drivers of each of those cities quite different, and need to be understood in order to take a strategic asset allocation position on where and what in each city, if money is to be allocated to each city, and not just Australian office is doing 10.3% total return for the last year. That sounds good. Let's get into it. Arrears pinned back. Well, that's throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded that 10.3 last year is effectively meaningless, and is useful for performance measurement of a portfolio compared to other portfolios, and drives performance fees and all that sort of stuff perhaps, but isn't in and of itself a tool useful in strategy beyond forming an understanding of what happened, and then the next question is, why did that happen? Why was Sydney 13.6 or whatever it was, and why was Brisbane this, and why was Melbourne that? Okay, because of this, that, and that, right? Okay, but how is that going to translate into next year, and not only next year, but in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time, depending on how long I want to hold that asset. And industrial property has kind of been the winner out of the online phenomenon, the whole wholesale warehouse and logistics distribution centres located near typically road, but also rail for longer distance stuff, or ports or airports. While industrial property has always had a much lower barrier to entry, because it's much easier to buy 10,000 square metres of industrial land out somewhere than it is to buy 10,000 metres in the middle of the CBD and build a 15-metre high shed with some roller doors than to build 45-storey office building. It's chalk and cheese. And so the barrier to entry much lower, which has therefore typically seen industrial yields structurally higher and necessarily higher to reflect that higher risk, because if I can do that, then somebody can buy the piece of land next door and do that themselves, and there's not much stopping them. And they'll build it to coincide with my tenant's lease expiring, and they'll move next door, and hey presto. Notwithstanding that, groups like Goodman have done particularly well out of this cycle and have responded to it, and have built sheds appropriate to it, not just them, Charter Hall and others, and have done very well out of recognising that component of the cycle and catering for it, and no reason to think that that's not likely to continue in the foreseeable future. Notwithstanding the prospect that maybe that last mile delivery might now come out of the smaller shopping centres, as I mentioned before. And then of course the alternatives, the childcare, the healthcare, and the medical centres and car parks, all sort of other stuff, all completely different metrics and drivers. Hotels as well. Hotels were doing brilliantly a few years ago, and now they're sort of a bit flat. And childcare centres. I recall trying to buy a childcare centre for my portfolio only 3 or 4 years ago, and I was looking at like sub 5%. I thought that's crazy. The extreme compression in those asset classes is, in my view, not sustainable, and so they will revert to mean a little bit sort of back towards 6 and 7 over time, and simply the weight of money that has driven this asset price inflation that we've seen over 15 years or longer, so that weight of money isn't going to stop anytime soon, because we're still getting 9.5% every fortnight, month, pouring into Australian Super and Host Plus and all of these other super funds that have allocations to real estate to fulfill, and have to go and do it. And same with the investment managers. They're getting money from high net worths and from the super funds. And what are they going to do with it? They either have to create it, develop it, and some of them don't have the mandate to do that, the externally managed ones, or they buy it and they're paying full price, or a very full price, or they adjust their asset allocations, or they go overseas and start doing that, as we saw in 2004, 5, 6, with some of the big famous names going off to the UK and Europe, the US, and blowing up billions of dollars. There's some merger and acquisition activity, as we've started to see in Europe and Asia, a fair bit of that, as an easier or less traumatic way of getting increased exposure to real estate is just to buy somebody else that already has that portfolio, already has the systems running that portfolio and the people, and a bit of synergy, that's fantastic, and do it at a corporate level rather than an asset to asset level, which can be particularly time consuming, high risk, and not very efficient. So those are sort of the 5 options available to these investment managers and super funds. Are going to do all of those things, but certainly the investment managers. So that was a particularly long answer to a very simple question.
Perfect. That's what I was hoping for. And given that you run a business, property business, you've lived overseas as well as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. Let's say you're starting out again, you know what you know now. Where would you go? Why would you go there? And what would you set up in terms of a property for your business and the house or unit that you're going to live in? And what are you looking at when you make those decisions?
Okay, so how old am I?
Let's say you're anywhere between 35 and 45 with a young family or looking to have a young family.
Okay, so that changes the answer.
Okay.
So I had visions of 25 to 30, in which case immediately I'd say London, hands down.
Right, okay.
Because it's easier to go and live in London than New York, or for me anyway.
Yeah.
But it is a boundless opportunity, and also the things that they do in London are sophisticated in one sense, but Neanderthal in another sense.
Okay.
So there is a level of sophistication that we in Australia can take to the United Kingdom. I'm about to get a lot of hate now from London now for everybody, and in terms of portfolio investment management, probably, and funds management, so that's what I would do if I was 25 to 30 something. 35 to 45, different story.
Or even and that gap from sort of 30 to 35, what would you be doing at that point? Like you've gone to uni, you've got your initial jobs, you've gone to London from 25 to 30, you've met some people over there, you've got some good experience. You come back at 30, what are you doing?
Okay.
Where are you?
Melbourne.
Yep.
So I came to Brisbane, twice. I'm not sure. I don't know anybody else who's moved from London to Brisbane twice, which sounds really stupid and is. But I ended up in Melbourne both times, ironically enough, because Melbourne, from my experience, tends to appreciate British experience more,
right.
and so the absence of local Brisbane experience, knowledge, connections isn't as important in Melbourne as it is here in Brisbane, and also Melbourne is the most, in my view, the most European city.
Yes.
In this part of the world, so taking the the knowledge and experience of Britain and deploying it into Melbourne. I think the more useful passage would be from Asia into Melbourne, because that's the seat of more money coming in, and so to be a conduit for that money, to be a local language speaker in Vietnam, Shanghai, and Tokyo, Singapore. Well, there's more English anyway, but Mandarin. Yeah, exactly. So if I was living in Southeast Asia somewhere, I would throw myself into learning language, making connections, and building trust with the locals, and then deploying myself here and being that conduit, which is not really as easy to do from the United States or Europe or the UK, because things operate a little bit differently there, and a lot of those organisations that are represented here already. But to access the high net worth individuals and some of the vast number of organisations that exist in Southeast Asia that we just don't even know about here, would be what I would do in that sort of 30, 35 age range. I think post 35, I'd probably, unless I'd been in Hong Kong a long time, I probably couldn't be there beyond that, because of it's a wild and exciting place, but some of the living conditions and the expense is incredible on a different level to what we have here, and so I'm not sure I could tolerate that myself. I'm sure there are plenty of people who could, and that probably applies for a lot of Asia. It's just so different in the way that it functions, and I like to have a fridge stack full of beer and stuff, whereas a lot of places there, like if you have a fridge or need a fridge, kind of thing, a bit of an extreme, but that sort of thing, and so the 35 to 45, probably looking for more comfort out of the US or Europe and Britain. Then I think the big thing there would be just basically that classic old saving pounds, and bringing them back. It's probably not as great now as it once was on the cross rate, but and certainly buying real estate in London, buying real estate in London in the 90s. Oh my God. And still can happen today, depending on what happens with Brexit. But it'll shake out. It might take 6 months, it might take 5 years, but eventually it'll shake out, and London will resume its position as one of the most important financial centres in the world, with New York and Tokyo and probably Singapore. Whether it resumes its position as absolute number one, or whether it ever was compared to New York, is debatable. But either way, whether it's one or two after Brexit, but still, London will always be, just by its nature, a magnet for business and for money. So to own real estate there is it's almost a privilege, and typically not a bad idea. That's not investment advice.
And just on that, I moved to Toronto in Canada, and obviously New York is another one, LA is another one, San Fran's another one. Is there a reason you omitted all of those?
Typically, well, not typically. I say typically a lot because I don't want to get sued.
Yeah.
I didn't spend a lot of time in the US. More of a kind of a passing through, kind of glancing look, really.
Yeah.
I didn't spend enough time there to truly understand it, so I tend not to talk to it a lot.
Yeah.
That notwithstanding, I loved San Francisco, I loved Los Angeles, for example, and And if I understood the places better, then sure, yeah, I probably would certainly consider it. Fundamentally, perhaps not Los Angeles, because they have a structural water and also an economic system problem, or seem to. But San Francisco has been one of the best performing cities for residential real estate for a long time, and their residential real estate is massively expensive. And so, having bought one, or had anybody bought one a while ago, they'd be on a bit of a gold mine, I expect.
I actually sold real estate in Toronto, and that was interesting because when I was finishing up there, it was a normal thing to have certain areas doing 30% a year on detached housing.
Yeah, wow.
And it felt like Melbourne to me. People say that Toronto is Sydney because it's the finance centre. For me, Vancouver is Sydney. Feels like Sydney. Lots of water, lots of trees.
Yeah, wow.
Melbourne is like Toronto as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. And it was cool. Lots of cafes, lots of live music. Entrepreneurship, I worked with a startup there. There was a mortgage brokerage. There was a real estate brokerage. There was a financial comparison website. We were all under the same roof.
Nice.
And so that was I guess you could say it was almost cohabitation. But that was something that I never would have expected to have done before. And so I could appreciate what it's like to work in an area where everyone is catching up on a regular basis and discussing ideas. And I know we've got this talk about maybe not having to commute from home to go to work or something along those lines. Personally, like when I come to work, I love being with the people I work with. And I think that's an important thing. And unfortunately, we've got to wrap it up because we're going for a meeting. But Mark, thanks very much for your input today.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, Chris.
And I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Good.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.